we like to do now is to set the stage about what CESTI is and what has been done to date. And Debra and I will talk about this with Debra, spending more time describing this, but I'll frame this the issue up. So could I have the slide, please? Right. So next slide. I said from the very beginning, as the National Humanities Center was looking through its strategic plan, getting really great minds of our membership and others, consulting with a lot of people, say, what do we want to do the next 5 years? This plan, which was kicked off in 2018, we have 3 goals. Third goal, which is critical, and Keith Yamamoto played a big role in this, is to look at science and our leadership capacity to bring science together to shape the future of health and medicine. In this context, we were very cognizant of the necessity to incorporate new platforms and new approaches, innovation, to accelerate advances in health science and medicine. But we also recognize as an academy and a community of great thinkers, we should also recognize that along with this innovation are the potential social, ethical, and workforce implications. So we decided we should address that. And that's why we formed, as you heard from Gary, all the issues, we formed this committee. Next slide. So you can see very quickly, we're influenced by Gary's thinking. The quote on the top says, we need coordinated action. Emerging technologies involve complex mix of applications, risks, benefits, uncertainty, stakeholders, and public concerns. So we recognize no single entity is able to govern any of these multifaceted and rapidly moving fields. And that's why we thought we'd bring a committee together and say, what can we do in this space? And the committee is charged to say, let's take a look at, monitor, anticipate, and identify those emerging developments that can truly transform health and medicine. And we want to encourage that. At the same time, we recognize, as Gary talked about, the multiple factors and interactions that shape the translation and the application. And then take a step back and say, how do we analyze the risk and societal implications, capture additional complexity, social disruptions, and geopolitical contexts, and then put together a straw model. And I say straw because the study committee will really create a final framework, but we wanted to do enough work to have multi-sectoral governance for emerging technologies. Next slide. And as you have heard, the committee is really, really impressive. Next slide, please. It starts off with our 3 co-chairs that I already introduced, but as you can see, and you may not be able to see, but let me just highlight a few things. We have people with regulatory experience, such as Scott Gottlieb, previously FDA commissioner, and Amy Abernathy, the deputy, at the time she was part of the committee, she was actually a deputy commissioner of FDA, being willing to join us as a public-private discussion. She's now Verily. We have people who are innovators in science, in engineering, and in medicine. And you can recognize many of those names. And we have people who have actually transitioned to be investment and industries, such as Rick Klausner, previous NCI director, and of course, people who've done a lot of different things, as well as initially Jennifer Doudna, who had to step up because after he got a Nobel Prize, not much time to spend, but Bob Kocher, another one who's in fact now in venture world, but previously one of the architects of the ACA, what we now call Obamacare, social scientists like Arthur Sharrow, Kaushik Rajan, and of course Keith Wailu, and Jeff Kahn, and of course many others who bring different perspective. You hear from Tim Evans from the Government Accountable Office in technology assessment, and I really don't have time to recognize. Suffice the thing I want to emphasize is the idea that we really got people from all sectors. And sometimes it's a little difficult if we want to simply say, nobody have any financial conflict. Well, we decided we're not going to be concerned about this because the committee is supposed to bring all different ideas and let the consensus study being a little more careful about how to project the issue of conflict. Next slide. But I think importantly, as I said, we approach it by case studies. We want to use cases as a way to say, what are the missing pieces? What are the lessons learned? What do we need? And so we use cases particularly to illustrate multi-sectoral cases. And then after that, we say, this is what it looks like today. What would it look like in the future as this technology become ever more innovative and expensive, as well as, in fact, the change in geopolitical environment. And then, of course, importantly, to bring together social ethical framework to apply to these cases. And what we've done in year 1 and 2 is to focus on those things. And year 3 is to create this framework that Debra later on tomorrow will show you. And this is really great work, but also convene public meetings workshop. This is an example of this. And then moving towards consensus study as we're now doing. So the framework will describe tools, delineate an ecosystem, suggest mechanisms to coordinate across actors, governance instruments relevant to this emerging technology. My last slide. I want to show you how much work has gone into it. This is only committee studies, but between committees, the case study have working groups to work on an ongoing basis to guide the work. And of course, Debra, that we are very fortunate to got from Johns Hopkins, seconded to us part-time, along with our outstanding group of staff. And as the last slide actually demonstrated who they are, I don't have time to recognize all of them. There's 5 of them. It's an amazing team that pulled this together. But this slide shows you the 2 years of work with multiple committees, and where we are right now is 2022, this public workshop. So let me turn it over to Debra.
Terrific. Thank you, Victor. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Terrific. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the work that CESTI has done over the last 2 years. You just heard that we took a case study approach to teach us about what has worked and what has not worked in the governance of emerging technologies. These were intended to provide concrete examples of emerging technologies and their implications, to enable us to look across sectors at how governance has developed and worked or not worked in various cases, to enable the identification of key stakeholders, and to draw both common and unique lessons across a set of cases. As part of the case study, the lessons from the core case study draw lessons from the past, but don't necessarily teach us about the concerns we have about emerging technologies that haven't yet come to pass, but are nonetheless important for the development of a governance framework, which is why each case includes a complementary visioning or forecasting component that takes the technology sort of 10 to 15 years in the future to allow us to consider potential futures and to highlight additional elements or concerns that aren't captured in the core case. And the case studies are sort of the bottom-up part of our approach. And the cases are, of course, extended and challenged by visioning, which I just mentioned, and then they're paired with normative and conceptual commitments coming from the top down and guiding the overall work. Ideally, then, the plan was for these to join in the middle with actionable guidance, which I will come to later. So to build the case, we first selected sort of a broad area in primary technology. And this selection was driven by this technology having both a track record of governance and the anticipation that there would be future evolution as well. We looked at the cross-sectoral footprint of that technology, meaning it didn't exist just in one space, but rather across different spaces, often sort of governed by different regulatory agencies, et cetera. And we sought a diversity of issues across these cases. We did a literature review, informational interviews, not only with subject matter experts on the CESTI committee, but also outside of the committee. Each case study and each visioning component had a working group of both committee members and outside folks. And then, of course, the case studies went through an iterative process of committee review. All three cases are structured similarly, again, so that we can draw those lessons across cases, and we are sure that we're sort of collecting the same kinds of information about each case. Each case starts with a vignette that highlights one or more concerns and really grounds the case in sort of individual stories. The background of where the technology has been and is going. These cases are sort of governed or structured by a set of guiding questions, which includes what is the historical context of the technology? What is the history of the technology or of this general space that's important for understanding how the technology is perceived or positioned today? Status quo, sort of again, what are the key questions, research areas, and products or applications today? And then the cross-sectoral footprint analysis, wherein we looked at how the technology was developing, being used, and being governed across a range of sectors. And you'll see here the sectors that we looked at. We fully acknowledge that no system of sort of dividing up the world is going to be perfect. There will inevitably be overlap. For example, government could have been broken down into international, national, regional, or civilian, military, et cetera, but it was a useful way for us to structure the case, again, to ensure that we were getting a broad view on the development of the technology. We looked importantly at the ethical and societal implications of the technology, again, across these various sectors. We then looked sort of just a bit beyond the technology to look at how the technology was being extended today. What were the additional technologies, sort of the catalyzing technologies that enhanced the capacities of the core technology, and then ending again with the visioning. So I'm just going to very briefly run through the three cases we chose. I'm not going to spend much time at all on these, but I wanted to give you a flavor for the kinds of things we looked at. So the first case was a case in neurotechnology, specifically looking at transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS, which is a non-invasive neuromodulation technology that's portable, relatively inexpensive, and relatively safe. It's been around for decades, but the last 10 years has shown sort of a dramatic increase in interest and use of this technology. One of the reasons that we were interested in this technology is because it also has a robust do-it-yourself component. So not only are these devices available direct to consumer, but there are also instructions for making them at home that folks can find on the internet. And the visioning piece here that again looks at what might this technology look like, sort of plausibly in the next 10 to 15 years. And the visioning case for TDCS was the use of brain-computer interfaces in the workplace. The second case we developed was, rather than a specific technology, more a broad platform that is telehealth. This ended up being particularly well-timed given the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on telehealth in this country. Telehealth has, of course, been around for quite some time, but there was a radical expansion in response to the pandemic, which actually taught us some really important lessons. The visioning component here was about a cloud-based AI-enabled hospital at home model for monitoring and care of the elderly. And then the third case was a bit different in that it looked at a biologic. So we focused on regenerative medicine and particularly its use in hematologic disease. This was a very long, rich case that took us through not only sort of early bone marrow transplant, through stem cell science, and sort of into what regenerative medicine has become today. Here, there's a question, not just of financial access. There always are questions of financial access with new technologies, but also because of the way that genetics and immunologic response play into the use of cellular treatments. There's a question of biological access as well, and significant equity issues. The visioning component here was about the off-label use of cellular rejuvenation therapies. And as mentioned previously, we used these cases to draw out themes about and lessons for governance. These themes don't equate to sort of components of a governance framework, but rather highlight issues that any framework that might be developed must attend to or take account of. So just some of the common themes that we found were, for a particular technology, the coexistence of health and non-health applications. For example, the use of TDCS both in management of chronic pain and for increasing focus for gaming applications. The regulatory nimbleness in response to COVID, the special issues that arise when people and their data are products, the impact of early public success or failure on innovation, mentioned before by Gary Marchant, talking about one small company could sort of ruin things for the whole field. And then there were also, of course, unique themes. For example, minimal physical risks enabling permissiveness of use in the case of TDCS. Flexibility or lack of oversight in the gray area that exists before you have proven efficacy and a regulated product. So again, these case studies and the visioning pieces were used to draw out lessons to inform ultimately a governance framework. And I mentioned previously how the case studies were sort of the bottom-up approach, learning from the past and projecting a bit into the future with visioning. But of course, all of this needs to be guided by principles and values. Now, focus of CESTI has been the development of tools for the translation of our guiding principles and values into policy choices. I mean, oftentimes guiding ethical principles are articulated, but there's no way then, no frameworks, no tools for taking those ethical principles and actually translating them into policy choices. And CESTI tried to begin that work. So we articulated not just ethical principles, but also the policy development process goals and content goals that follow from those principles. And then we began work on policy tools that follow from those goals. Now, the next slide I'm going to show you is very busy. It's this same schematic, but just with additional detail added. So here you can see the high-level principles and values that we articulated: justice, autonomy, fairness, collective good, and individual good. These will be familiar to everyone. And then the sort of goals the policy goals that follow from those principles. For example, under how policy is made: transparency, explainability, and intelligibility, diversity and inclusion. What policy is made: responsible innovation, protection of individual preferences, reducing inequalities. And then again, we just started on what are the tools for the policy tools that can help, again, translate these principles into governance choices. For example, through funding conditions, public consultation and engagement, full and accessible information. So as I mentioned before, this top-down approach paired with the bottom-up cases was intended to then inform a cross-sectoral governance framework in the middle. And these are the framework elements of such a governance framework that out of all of this work, CESTI sort of distilled to help inform the consensus study. And I'm going to go into much more detail on all of these elements tomorrow afternoon. But again, it starts with the foundational core of these ethical principles and values. Any framework must have us sort of be grounded in a strong, robust scientific assessment, as well as public engagement and democratic deliberation. There must be tools for assessment. The ones we've highlighted are a cross-sectoral analysis and stakeholder identification, foresight or visioning, risk-benefit analysis, critically, the alignment of incentives and disincentives. And then we've developed what we're calling a composite heat map that is a tool to gauge where current governance for a particular technology is doing well with reference to the guiding ethical principles, and where there are more challenges and maybe more governance attention needs to be focused. And then of course, there need to be ongoing mechanisms for iterative evaluation and course correction. So again, I will go into all of that in more